Before diving into this incredible story, remember to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, every story has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. Rain fell in fine drops on the city rooftops, reflecting the multicolored neon signs. The streets were deserted at this late hour, save for the occasional taxi hurrying by and figures lost in the night. In a narrow alley, a young woman walked purposefully, her boots clicking softly on the wet cobblestones. Her name, Sophie Carter. At first glance, Sophie seemed ordinary, a smiling, reserved engineering student, known to her classmates for her curiosity and calm demeanor. But behind her intelligent, brown eyes lay a very different life. Since her adolescence, her father, a former army sniper, had trained her in the art of precision shooting, strategy, and patience. Her years of training had made her an expert capable of assessing dangers, trajectories, and weak points in mere seconds. This strict discipline had forged in her a cold, calculating mind, but one of formidable efficiency. That night, she was simply supposed to be heading home after a late project at university. Her light bag contained her usual belongings, but also a small, carefully concealed, folding sniper rifle, ready to be assembled in seconds. She had learned to always prepare for the worst, even for a simple walk. As she passed beneath a flashing street lamp, a shiver ran down her spine. 3 figures emerged from the shadows. Their gazes were hard, suspicious, and their intentions clear: attack, intimidation, robbery. The men thought they had the situation under control. They knew nothing about Sophie, her past, her skills, and the deadly precision that made her an adversary never to be underestimated. Sophie stopped, quickly assessing the scene. Every detail, every movement was registered in her mind: the position of each attacker, the distance between them, the slightest obstacle in the alley. She knew every second would count. A faint smile touched her lips. They thought they were preying on someone, but tonight, they were the ones who would discover that behind the appearance of an ordinary student hid a sharpshooter. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the rain continued to fall, like a silent soundtrack announcing the impending confrontation. Sophie was ready. Sophie walked down the alley, her bag swaying slightly on her shoulder. The rain had stopped, but the cobblestones remained slippery, reflecting the orange glow of the streetlights. She could feel the tension in the air, the sense that danger still lurked in the city's dark corners. 3 men suddenly emerged from the shadows, their gait confident and menacing. The first, the tallest, pulled out a thin-bladed knife. The second, stocky and wiry, rummaged through his coat pockets, ready to strike. The third, silent but agitated, watched Sophie with a wicked smile. "Give me your bag," shouted the tall man, his rough voice echoing off the walls. "No sudden movements, and you'll be fine." Sophie stopped, took a deep breath, and observed. The 3 criminals didn't notice the small metal device protruding from her bag. Her heart beat calmly, each beat rhythmic, almost mechanical. She analyzed their positions, the distance, the angles. A plan formed in her mind in a few seconds. The fastest of the 3 stepped forward to grab her bag. Sophie took a step back, sliding her arm under the bag to set it on the ground, feigning fear. She knew he was expecting a weak target. She smiled inwardly. They would discover too late that she wasn't vulnerable. With a fluid motion, she pulled the folding sniper rifle from its bag and opened it in a precise movement. The barrel deployed silently, the scope adjusted to the height of her targets. The first man suddenly felt a sharp pain in his shoulder. A precise, instantaneous shot sent him reeling backward. The second man screamed when the bullet struck his leg, pinning him to the ground. The third tried to flee, but Sophie, without taking her eyes off the scope, fired again. The bullet hit him in the arm, disarming him instantly. The 3 men were now unable to move, lying on the ground, horrified by what had just happened. Sophie put her rifle back in its bag, calmly and precisely closing each compartment, as if nothing had happened. She rose and walked slowly, her heels echoing on the wet pavement, leaving behind humiliated and paralyzed men. The rain was falling lightly again, almost erasing all trace of the confrontation. No one in that alley would ever know what had just happened. To them, the victim had left without a fight. But in the shadows, a sharpshooter had just reminded the city that beneath a fragile appearance could lie an implacable force. The next morning, the city seemed oblivious to the previous night's events. The newspapers reported only minor thefts and minor fights. But for Sophie, nothing was trivial. She knew her actions had attracted the attention of the wrong people, and that there would be repercussions. She walked through the crowded streets, her bag always carefully adjusted, her gaze discreet but watchful. Every passerby could be a witness, a danger, or an obstacle. Since the attack, her mind had been on constant alert, assessing potential threats. At university, Sophie resumed her role as a studious student. She blended into the crowd of young people, taking notes, discussing projects, her face calm. But every movement, every noise, every gesture around her was registered by her brain as a silent preparation for a possible confrontation. Meanwhile, the three men from the alley were in the wrong hands. The first, the one with the injured shoulder, had been found by a local criminal group who knew his reputation. The humiliation he had suffered the previous night had not gone unnoticed, and they would soon seek revenge. Sophie had to anticipate this reaction. Upon returning home, she performed a ritualistic walkthrough of her apartment, checking doors, windows, and blind spots. Her small apartment seemed ordinary, but every piece of furniture, every object, had its place for strategic use if necessary. She stowed her folding sniper rifle in its secret safe, accessible only through a mechanism known only to her. Sitting on her bed, she thought back to the alley. Her composure had been her greatest strength. The men had been surprised by her precision and speed. She knew that many underestimated young women, and that worked in her favor. But she also knew that last night's attack was only the beginning. A shiver ran through her, her opponents wouldn't give up easily. And Sophie, behind her calm exterior, smiled slightly. She was ready for them. A few days had passed since the attack in the alley, but Sophie felt the weight of an unseen presence. Every step in the streets, every shadow seemed more menacing. She knew that the men she had neutralized had not forgotten the humiliation, and that their anger would not remain confined to whispers. That evening, as she walked home from university with her bag over her shoulder, a feeling of unease washed over her. The alley she knew so well seemed different, darker, quieter. And then, a sharp noise behind her, quick, uneven footsteps. Sophie Carter. A guttural voice, full of rage and defiance. She turned slowly. 3 figures emerged from the shadows. The same men? Almost. Their faces were now etched with hatred, and their movements betrayed their haste. This time, they were accompanied by a fourth, taller man carrying a metal bat. Sophie felt the adrenaline surge, but her face remained impassive. She knew that running would be pointless. The narrow alley offered no escape. She had to face this attack with precision and composure. The men lunged at her. Sophie took a step back, quickly assessing the distance and trajectory of their attacks. Her reflexes, honed by years of training, kicked in. She discreetly pulled out a small pistol she kept in her belt. A series of fluid, calculated movements, she dodged the bat, feinted a step forward, and neutralized the first man with a perfectly aimed shot to the leg, sending him sprawling to the ground. The second and third men, surprised by her speed, staggered back, while the fourth, enraged, lunged to strike her with his bat. Sophie, remaining calm, adjusted her position, fired again, hitting the bat and the man's arm, instantly disarming him. In less than a minute, the 4 assailants were on the ground, unable to continue their attack, panting and in shock. Sophie carefully holstered her weapon and stood up. She had, once again, brought the situation under control with composure and precision. As she walked away, her heels clicking on the pavement, she knew one thing: this battle was just a taste of what was to come. The criminals would come up with something stronger, something more cunning. But Sophie was ready. Every challenge strengthened her composure, every confrontation sharpened her reflexes. During the night, a figure watched him from a neighboring balcony. A new player had entered the game, someone who knew his past and his skills. The real threat was only just beginning. The morning after the attack, Sophie awoke with heightened alertness. She had slept barely 3 hours, her mind racing with recent events and the looming threats. She knew her assailants weren't just petty criminals, their coordination, audacity, and thirst for revenge pointed to a more structured network. Sophie reviewed her equipment in the apartment. Every weapon, every tool had its place, ready to be used. But she knew she couldn't just react. This time, she had to anticipate. At university, she observed the people around her more closely. Faces, gestures, attitudes, every detail could be valuable information. She began to notice strange things, students who seemed to follow her movements, lingering stares that vanished when she turned away. Someone was watching her. Back home, Sophie used her contacts in the military and tactical world to investigate. She discovered that the 3 men belonged to a local group known for coordinated attacks and surveillance. Their presence nearby was no coincidence. They were tasked with assessing and neutralizing any threat to their organization. And now, they had identified her as a threat. A chill ran through Sophie. She wasn't just in danger, she was facing a network ready to strike with precision and brutality. But unlike them, she had experience, strategy, and the advantage of surprise. She went to an old shooting range she'd used since her teens to practice. There, she tested her weapons, calculated distances, and mentally rehearsed possible scenarios. Each shot was a reminder of her accuracy, her control, and her ability to neutralize any threat before it materialized. As she finished her session, her phone vibrated. An anonymous message. "You're more talented than expected. But the game has only just begun. We're watching you." Sophie slipped the phone into her pocket, her expression unchanged. She knew every move had to be calculated, every mistake could be fatal. The network wanted fear, for haste. But she would remain calm, methodical, and ready. It was no longer simply a matter of defense. It was a battle of intelligence and strategy, and Sophie was determined not to let the shadow win. In the city, the dark alleyways seemed less silent. Someone was following her, observing her habits. And Sophie, invisible to most, was already beginning to prepare her counteroffensive. Sophie knew that remaining on the defensive wouldn't be enough. Her enemies were organized, cunning, and determined to get revenge. If she wanted to survive, she had to turn the tables and put them in a vulnerable position. She spent the day preparing her plan. In her apartment, she spread out city maps, photos of the alleyways, and surrounding buildings on a table. Every exit, every nook and cranny, every vantage point was noted. She identified several strategic locations where she could control the angle of attack and hide while keeping an eye on her enemies. At dusk, she went to an alley she knew perfectly, narrower and longer than the one where the first attack took place. She had discreetly set up a few portable cameras capable of sending images to her phone in real time. She had also left a bag lying around that appeared vulnerable, a decoy intended to attract criminals. A few minutes later, as expected, hurried footsteps echoed behind her. 3 figures emerged from the shadows, the same men from the previous attack, this time accompanied by a new face, a massive man whose reputation for brutality was already well established. "This time, you won't escape us," spat the tall one, the one whose shoulder was touched the first time. Sophie, motionless, observed every movement. She showed no fear, no haste. The criminals advanced toward the decoy, oblivious to the cameras and the calculated distance. She had chosen her angle precisely. If necessary, she could neutralize each of them before they reached her actual position. As they approached, one of the men tripped over the bag, and Sophie pretended to back away. Their faces reflected the excitement of prey within reach. But behind this illusion of vulnerability lurked a sharpshooter ready to strike. With a swift, silent movement, she activated a small mechanism that slammed a trapdoor shut in front of the alley, blocking their retreat. Trapped and confused, the men began to panic. Sophie seized the opportunity to adjust her aim with her folding rifle, perfectly concealed in a blind spot. With a few precise shots, each was neutralized, one in the leg, one in the shoulder, the last disarmed before he even understood what was happening. The massive man tried to charge, but Sophie had anticipated an obstacle that forced him off course. He collapsed, unable to continue. When she finally emerged from her hiding place, she observed the criminals on the ground. They were humiliated, paralyzed by incomprehension and pain. Sophie calmly, almost mechanically, holstered her rifle before disappearing into the shadows of the city. That night, she had turned the hunt into a trap. The pursuers had become the hunted. But Sophie knew this was only the beginning. Someone more powerful and dangerous than these men was orchestrating everything from the shadows. And soon, she would have to confront this true enemy. After her victory in the booby-trapped alley, Sophie knew she had to be more careful than ever. The men she had neutralized were merely pawns in a larger game. The true mastermind behind this series of attacks remained unknown, and it was clear he knew her past and her skills. She spent the morning analyzing the footage from the cameras she had placed in the alley. Every detail, every gesture of the criminals, every reaction was scrutinized. Then, in one of the images, a detail caught her eye, a discreet symbol tattooed on the wrist of the new, burly man who had participated in the attack. Sophie frowned. She recognized the symbol. It belonged to an old clandestine network she'd encountered during her military training with her father. This network, it was said, recruited violent and unscrupulous men to carry out clandestine missions throughout the city. And now, it seemed to be behind the attacks against her. Determined to understand the extent of the danger, Sophie discreetly contacted a former military instructor of her father, a mentor named Colonel Marcus Hale, a man respected for his knowledge of criminal networks and counter-surveillance operations. "Sophie, you shouldn't be the only one," Marcus said upon hearing her report. "This network is more dangerous than you think. They have resources, observers, and, most importantly, a leader capable of manipulating the entire city from the shadows." "I know," Sophie replied calmly. "But I can't remain passive. If I don't find out who's behind all this, these men will continue to hunt me down." Marcus paused. "Very well. Listen to me carefully. The head of this network is nicknamed the Raven. No one knows his face. He always acts through proxies, using men as pawns. But he is intelligent, methodical, and he never leaves direct traces. You will have to be more cunning than him." Sophie felt a shiver run down her spine. The Raven was more than just a threat, it represented the intelligence and strategy of a master manipulator, capable of planning several moves ahead. But she smiled slightly. Every master has a weakness. And she was ready to find hers. "Thank you, Colonel. I'll take care of it." As she hung up, her gaze fell on her apartment window. The street seemed quiet, but she knew someone was watching her. The game had just taken a more complex turn. The Raven was invisible, but Sophie would hunt him down. And when she did, he would discover that beneath the guise of an ordinary student lurked a ruthless adversary. Sophie knew that confronting the Raven directly was impossible. He was invisible, elusive, and controlled his men from the shadows. The only way to neutralize him was to understand his network from the inside, to draw him out of the darkness. She began with the men she had previously neutralized. None had survived their injuries without being hospitalized, but their allies had likely received information. Sophie had to play a game of deception and manipulation. As night fell, she went to an abandoned industrial area where rumors suggested the network had a temporary hideout. Her plan was simple but risky: leave visible clues to her presence to attract attention, while remaining invisible herself. She wanted to provoke the Raven and entice him to send someone to investigate. She installed a small transmitter in an old van, simulating the presence of vulnerable prey. Then, from an elevated vantage point, she observed. The cold night wind whipped her face, but she remained focused, her eyes scanning for every movement. A few minutes later, 3 men appeared, silent and efficient. They inspected the van, but Sophie knew they were only there to test her vigilance. She remained motionless, breathing calmly, ready to react to the slightest movement. As they tried to force the lock, an anonymous message appeared on his phone. "Interesting, you're playing with us. Very good. The Raven is watching." Sophie smiled slightly. He was there, somewhere, invisible, analyzing her every move. She knew she had just piqued his curiosity, exactly as she had intended. Now he had to act, send someone or intervene himself. She was ready to trap him. She retreated into the shadows, almost disappearing completely, while the men inspected the van. A few quick, silent, targeted shots neutralized two of them. The third tried to flee, but Sophie had a safety net in place, capturing him before he reached the exit. By retrieving documents and a phone from the men, she finally discovered a crucial clue, a partial location where the Raven might be hiding to coordinate his operations. It wasn't the complete address, but it was enough to begin her hunt. As she walked away, the icy wind whistled through the empty buildings. Sophie knew she had provoked a reaction, but the real game was only just beginning. The Raven would soon discover that she was not mere prey, but an adversary willing to do anything to bring him down. Sophie had finally located the Raven's likely lair. An old, abandoned factory on the outskirts of town, surrounded by rusty fences and dilapidated buildings. The place seemed deserted, but she knew better than to trust appearances. Every noise, every shadow could conceal a trap. Before the assault, she checked her equipment. Her folding sniper rifle, her pistol, and several tactical devices were ready. She had also prepared a precise plan: neutralize the guards without alerting the Raven, infiltrate the building, and force a confrontation. Every second would count. Night had fallen, and the wind whistled through the metal structures. Sophie approached stealthily, using the shadows to move forward. The camera she had installed the previous week had helped her map the blind spots and the guards' patrol routes. She slipped behind the first guard, neutralizing him with a precise, silent blow. One by one, the other men fell without alerting the leader. Finally, she reached the central room, a vast space half-lit by hanging lamps. And there he was. The Raven. Still in the shadows, a massive silhouette, but this time she could see him, a calm, imposing figure, his eyes shining with intelligence and defiance. "Sophie Carter," he murmured. "You were more cunning than I thought. But now you're trapped." "I am never the prey," Sophie replied, her voice firm and icy. "This time, you're the one who's going to fall." A precise exchange of fire ensued. Sophie moved fluidly, using the columns and abandoned machinery for cover. Every move of the Raven was calculated, but she anticipated his actions. Her years of training and recent experiences gave her the advantage. She knew her opponent almost as well as he knew her. In a final strategic move, Sophie lured the Raven into a narrow area, a corridor she had identified as perfect for a trap. There, she used a cable and a lever system to corner him, immobilizing the network's mastermind. The Raven, taken by surprise, was unable to evade the attack. Sophie approached, her weapon pointed at him. "You underestimated someone calm, precise, and invisible," she said. "Now it's all over." The Raven said nothing. His gaze was a mixture of respect and defiance. Sophie had won, but she knew that this type of person always leaves a mark. She securely bound the Raven and escorted him to the authorities, leaving the silent building behind. That night, the city was still unaware of the battle that had just taken place in its shadows. But for Sophie Carter, the invisible young student, it was a resounding victory. The prey had become the hunter, and the Raven's threat had been neutralized. The day after the Raven's capture, rumors began to circulate throughout the city. The media spoke of a major police operation that had dismantled a clandestine criminal network, but no one knew the identity of the person who had provided the crucial information. Sophie, meanwhile, continued her life as if nothing had happened, feigning the innocence of an ordinary student. Yet, her daily life had changed. She felt the stares of those around her, the whispers in the university corridors, and sometimes even the grateful smiles of strangers. Sophie wasn't fooled. Some had realized that she was the force behind the network's dismantling, even if no one dared to say so publicly. As the days went by, she received anonymous messages of gratitude and respect. Information from reliable sources indicated that several members of the network had been arrested thanks to the evidence she had collected, and that the Raven himself had been placed under maximum surveillance. Sophie knew that the immediate threat had been neutralized, but that the danger could reappear in another form. Despite everything, she resumed her studies with renewed determination. Her daily life as a student resumed, but behind her calm exterior lay constant vigilance and a sharp strategic mind. She continued her training, honing her skills, aware that the city was still teeming with hidden dangers. One evening, as she walked home, she observed the quiet streets and thought about all she had accomplished. She had transformed her fear into strength, her discretion into an advantage. Sophie now knew she could face any threat. She stepped into her apartment, closed the door behind her, and let out a soft sigh of satisfaction. The world was still unaware of the role she had played, but for Sophie Carter, it didn't matter. She had survived, she had won, and she was ready for whatever the future held. In the following weeks, the city returned to a relative calm. The Ravens network had been dismantled, and its men arrested or dispersed. But for Sophie, victory lay not only in the capture of criminals, it lay in self-control, in transforming her fear into strength, and in the certainty that she could face the unpredictable. She continued her studies, but every step she took in the streets, every interaction with others, was now tinged with a keen awareness of potential dangers. Not all of her old enemies had been eliminated, some were still on the run, but Sophie knew that, thanks to her training and strategy, she would be ready to face them. One evening, as she was observing the city from the roof of her building, her phone vibrated. A simple message. "You've changed the rules of the game. Well done, Sophie." She smiled. The message came from one of her former military mentors. It was a silent but significant acknowledgement. Her actions had not only neutralized an immediate threat, but had also left their mark on the shadowy world, proof that even the most discreet target could become a formidable force. Sophie climbed down from the roof, went back into her apartment, and carefully put away her weapons. They weren't there for gratuitous violence, but for protection and justice. She had learned to balance power and responsibility, and that lesson would stay with her forever. In the quiet city streets, some were still talking about rumors. A young woman, invisible to the world, had brought down an entire criminal network. The criminals themselves whispered the name, the Invisible Girl. But for Sophie, that title meant nothing. She wasn't seeking fame, only safety and justice. She resumed her daily routine, studies, training, constant vigilance. But deep down, she knew she was ready for anything that might happen. The city could sleep soundly, but she, Sophie Carter, would always remain a watchful eye in the shadows, ready to intervene at the first sign of danger. The prey had disappeared. The invisible huntress was born.